Yes, ma'am.
So, in my community, I'm an activist, and so I work as a manager at a housing property that's in a marginalized and underserved community. And the property management that I work for is a nonprofit.
Mhm.
So once I sat down and I told them what I do and what my mission was, they allow for me, because they're a nonprofit and they have this board that they have to do community things. So what I do is I use the community center to get things done.
Right.
So I use, we have all different kind of things here, communicate with the residents, let them know about moms in action. I mean, I'm allowed to do that. So my job and my activism, I'm able to do it at work also.
Yeah. Look in your jobs. Talk to people that some of y'all don't even talk to the folks you sit next to. They might have what you need. I know you may not like your boss, but he may know about a grant. Yes, ma'am. One last question. You are so much welcome. And this is my last comment. They're not going to come to you. You're going to have to go to them.
Yeah.
I'm done. I love y'all. Do it together.
Not too much fun around. That was amazing. She has such passion and humor and creativity. Thank you, Brenda. So this next case study is getting pulled up right now. It's called Incorporating VOCA Funding into Your City Gun Violence Work. And my name's Kaz Han, and I am, here we go. I'm a local group, I was a local group lead for our Seattle group about 4 years ago, and then I transitioned to community outreach lead about a year and a half ago. And I'm super excited about VOCA because it's a funding source that literally has billions of dollars that are set aside for victims of crime victims and victims of violence, including gun violence, that remain unused. So as a community outreach lead, I knew that building strong relationships with groups working to prevent gun violence from a different perspective than moms was going to make our movement stronger. We would learn from different strategies, we would learn about different solutions, and we would build our political strength. And I could have used my energy as a community outreach lead to outreach to any number of types of groups like suicide prevention, domestic violence, medical, all of those groups, but I gravitated towards, this quote here epitomizes why I gravitated to those groups who are working to prevent homicides and non-fatal shootings in our city's racially segregated neighborhoods. I was attending a community healing circle at one of our community partners, and the question was asked, when do you feel safe? And this young woman, this girl, 16-year-old girl, answered, I'll feel safe when I'm 6 feet under. And they asked, like, you don't even feel safe in your home? And no, she does not. She lives less than 2 miles from me. So volunteering with moms has really opened my eyes to the way gun violence is experienced way differently in Black and brown communities in Seattle. So when I'm afraid for my son, being in a classroom, or if I'm afraid of gun violence when he's attending a movie, like, I'm not afraid of him walking to school. I'm not afraid of him getting shot as he's coming home from basketball practice. It's just daily fear of gun violence that I don't have to experience. And so I got to see how gun violence is really intertwined with racism, and how our homicides really reflect and intensify our longstanding racial inequities. So it was important for me to volunteer to focus to help ending that. So how do we define city gun violence? Most forms of gun violence aren't really defined by where they take place geographically. It's likely that in all cities there's all types of gun violence, suicides, domestic violence, mass shootings, school shootings, police shootings, group violence. But there's something specific about the gun violence that most commonly happens in cities where a history of discriminatory policies have created conditions for violence. And so when we talk about gun violence, when we're talking about city gun violence, we're primarily talking about homicides and assaults. And addressing these forms of violence in these concentrated areas, it's a key part of the strategy to end gun violence in the US. So, next slide, please. Even though a lot of local groups have been working on preventing gun violence in cities all along, I've been so happy that every town has increased its commitment to prioritizing city gun violence and non-legislative work more broadly. So as we're learning here at GSU, there's really a thoughtful campaign around it, an infrastructure around it. We learned about the policy and implementation team that was formed in 2018, and its purpose is specifically to focus on non-legislative and programmatic work, in addition to helping implement and enforce laws that have been passed. So there are now city gun violence state leads and city gun violence local lead positions in our chapter leadership structure, with trainings, phone calls, and really great toolkits to support us. So there are several types of organizations and groups that Moms has identified to be effective in using non-legislative, evidence-based, community-driven strategies to reduce gun violence. And I think, am I echoing? No? Oh, thank you. And we've learned about these in other sessions, but just briefly, they fall into 4 categories. Long-term prevention, which can be a lot of youth-oriented work like Big Brothers Big Sisters. Immediate intervention, that's just prior to violence being used. Street outreach. Immediate response can be things like stopping the bleeding training to help increase survival rates. And then reintegration, things like hospital-based intervention programs and survivor support. And of course, a lot of these different types of groups overlap in different categories. I wish I had memorized this, I'm sorry. Next slide. So how does VOCA fit into the larger city gun violence work? So Moms has identified a few different ways that we're going to be allies in curbing city gun violence. And the first is to learn and evaluate. We are committed to seeking research and learning about what the solutions are. Groups have been working on this for decades, and so we definitely want to honor those leaders in the communities most affected. And we want to share with Moms leadership about the solutions that we find out about in our volunteer work. And then in turn, the national office, every town team is sharing with us solutions that they know about. The second way is to amplify. We're going to be elevating the voices of survivors, organizations, leaders, and their strategies to help bring public momentum through social media and within our personal networks. The third way is to support. The groups are doing great work. They know it works, but they run out of money. Grants run out, so we can help increase funds for their work. We can support them with our volunteer time and our energy, staffing events, or whatever they tell us that they need. So how can we support? To break that down a little bit further is where VOCA finally comes in. The first way I mentioned is volunteering. Second is grants. I think you've heard about some community partnership grants already. In Seattle, we were able to give a grant to a group called Community Passageways. They work with young people who've been charged with felonies, and they want to divert them from the criminal justice system. And these participants were given $100 each as a stipend to educate the public and community leaders and elected leaders and moms volunteers about how gun violence affects them and what solutions they know to be effective. So that was an example of a community partnership grant that Moms is providing. The third way is through legislative advocacy, and you all heard about the California success. I mean, it was like, what was it, $9 million it's like a $21 million increase, more than a 300% increase in funds, which was amazing. So I'm excited about that way we can support. And the last way is through VOCA funding. VOCA stands for Victims of Crime Act. And it provides federal funding for victims and survivors of violence, including gun violence. And if we can get the word out to help match these funds with community groups, then it can have a monumental impact. Yeah, so just take that in. That's in billions of dollars. Washington State has $75 million. And these are dollars that are set aside, and they're from fines and penalties paid by convicted federal offenders. It's not tax money. So the rationale is that by providing victims of crime support and services, we can really help those individuals recover and prevent future violence. Thank you. So how did I do this in Washington State? I'll just start out by saying I wasn't completely successful, but I think hearing my process and what I've learned so far can hopefully be helpful with you all. So I transferred to City Gun Violence Lead a few months ago, and at that time I'd already started building relationships with community groups that fall into the categories that are already using effective solutions. And I do want to stress that those relationships take a really long time, like any personal relationship, and that it's really an absolutely necessary first step for you to have built really strong relationships before you consider implementing or bringing VOCA work into your city gun violence work. So I've been building relationships for about a year, still very new relationships. And before I was able to kind of explore VOCA funding in my state, I really needed to learn like who was doing what in the Seattle area and how, like what was their niche, what were their priorities, what were their strategies, because there's so many amazing groups doing so much work that I would eventually want to match with funding, but I wasn't going to attempt to do that until I really learned who was doing what. So that is just basically, for me, it was a Google spreadsheet and like learning from the newspaper, from TV, like who's doing what, online websites, city websites, like sometimes you can find information from city or county staff who their job is to connect city funding with local groups. So that's what I did. I just started building a spreadsheet. And then I just kind of cold emailed them. I just sent out a bunch of emails to their inboxes and got a couple responses back, met with them. And I asked to meet with a lot of them, and maybe only a couple would respond. And then when I met with them, I just made sure that I focused on listening and learning about what they did. I did not offer any information about Moms Demand Action unless I was asked, because my goal was to understand more fully what they did. Sure.
So is your goal to try to assist these organizations in getting VOCA funding?
Yes, my goal is to try to get these organizations to receive VOCA funding, yes. So these are kind of the steps prior to that. So first you need to figure out who's doing what. Secondly, you need to build relationships with groups. And then next is like you learn about VOCA, yes.
You said when you went in, after following up on the emails, and you said you didn't use mom messaging, how did you present yourself to them?
The question is, if I wasn't talking about moms in these one-on-one meetings, what was I talking about? And the basically is, I'm with Moms Demand Action. We're working to prevent gun violence, and I know that you are doing great work in the community. Do you have time to sit down with me and tell me more about what you're doing? And then that's exactly what I asked them to do. Yes.
So is the VOCA funding coming in then through every town to this organization?
No, it's not. This is is it coming through, or are VOCA funds coming through every town to organizations? No, they're not. VOCA funding is a federal program that's administered state by state with a state administrator. So every town's role and mom's role is to be a matchmaker.
When you say match, is it a funding match or just matching the VOCA? I was just.
Yeah, I think I'll be able to answer the question a little bit. Sorry, can you say that louder? What is VOCA funding and what is it going to be used for? So it is a pot of money set aside from fees to help victims of crimes, to pay for all sorts of ways to support victims of crime. So it can be mentoring programs, it can be cognitive behavioral therapy, it can be help with funeral expenses, it can be all sorts of ways to support victims of crime. Office of what? No, I think maybe sometimes that's the same thing. It depends on the state. It varies state by state. So the next thing to do is to really do your homework about like, who is this VOCA administrator in my state? And that's not a really easy thing to find out. There's a lot of bureaucratic websites. There's offices like you're speaking about, like through the prosecutor's office or through all sorts of different city organizations. So what you need to do is do online research to figure out who's the administrator and who have they funded in the past, and maybe why are they funding those groups. For example, in Washington State, most of the money has gone towards victims of sexual assault crimes, and really not any has gone to victims of gun violence crimes. So my point is, like, try to do a lot of research before you actually call the administrator, because you don't want this relationship with the administrator can be very important moving forward, and you want to not come off like you don't know anything about what's going on. So try to find out as much as you can before you call them. There's a really great toolkit, City Gun Violence and VOCA toolkit, that will give you sample questions to ask, what you need to find out. But find out what you can online ahead of time, and then give the VOCA administrator a call. And I did that and found out how they give the funds out, and they basically use an RFP process. RFP stands for Request for Proposals. So they're basically like, okay, we want to provide cognitive behavioral therapy to victims who have been shot. We need a program that knows how to do that and can execute that. So send me your proposal on how you will do that. And so then the different community organizations will send their proposal or their application to get that funding. So when oh, yes.
Do VOCA, if they look for someone that's involved in that crime, that you cannot receive the funding from VOCA?
That's a really good-
Or some of my colleagues found out because some of their children were involved in crimes, they're looking for assistance with things they denied them.
That's a great question, and one that I had too. Like, could the perpetrators also receive funding if they were also victims of crimes? Is that the question?
Actually, no, they were the victims, but if they were defending themselves against the person who did the crime, they were still denied. Even though they were defending themselves from the crime, they still were denied.
Oh, okay, so they were defending themselves from
Yes.
the victim of the crime, and so they weren't eligible for funding.
Were not.
So it's gonna vary state by state. In Washington State, that was not a problem. And perpetrators are also, it doesn't matter if you have a felony conviction or what have you, any kind of conviction. If you're a victim of a crime, you're a victim of a crime. So it will vary state by state, and those are the types of questions that you'll need to find out. And you also, so I asked the VOCA administrator, I know these great organizations, can I send their names to you so that you can make sure they get the call out for requests for proposals? And she told me no, because she can't directly contact any community organizations because it would look like favoritism. So she asked that we make sure that these community groups are aware of these funding sources. So it's an amazing connection that Moms Volunteers can make with our partners. So there were a couple of grants that came out.